If you had told me that 2 parking tickets and a tow truck would end with an entire homeowners association begging my attorney to answer their phone calls, I probably would have laughed and driven back to work. But sometimes the smallest insult turns into the biggest mistake arrogant people ever make. And that's exactly what happened to me. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and 3 years ago, I inherited a little cedar cabin overlooking Silver Pine Lake from my grandfather, Walter. It wasn't some luxury vacation mansion with a private marina and a 6-car garage, just an old place that smelled like pine wood, fishing bait, coffee, and 40 years of family memories. The gravel parking pad beside it had been there longer than I had been alive, and every summer my grandfather would back his old pickup into the exact same spot before sitting on the porch to watch the sun disappear behind the trees. After he passed away, I kept the place exactly the way he left it, because some things don't need improvements, they just need respect. I worked remotely designing renewable energy systems, so every couple of weeks I would spend a few days at the cabin, answer emails during the morning, fish in the evening, and rent the place through a vacation website whenever I wasn't there. It wasn't making me rich, but it covered taxes and maintenance while letting the cabin stay in the family. The community around the lake had changed, though. Wealthier buyers started arriving, old cabins disappeared, and expensive houses with giant windows and perfectly trimmed lawns took their place. Along with them came a new HOA board led by a woman named Denise Harper, a former corporate consultant who loved using words like standards, modernization, and compliance. The first time I met her, she smiled without warmth and said, "Communities either evolve or decay, Mr. Caldwell." I remember joking that my grandfather's porch had survived more storms than most management consultants, but she didn't laugh. Looking back, that should have been my warning. During the next several months, neighbors started complaining over coffee at the marina. One family got cited because their mailbox wasn't the approved shade of black. Another because their boat cover looked faded. An elderly widower received 3 violation letters over flower pots his late wife had planted 20 years earlier. Every conversation ended with someone saying, "It's easier to pay than fight." I stayed out of it because I figured they had their rules and I had my work. Then came the Friday that changed everything. I arrived just after sunset with groceries, my laptop, and enough optimism to think I was about to enjoy a peaceful weekend. Instead, I found an empty gravel pad. At first, I honestly thought someone had stolen my truck. I walked around the cabin twice, checked behind the trees like an idiot, then noticed a bright orange paper tied to a wooden post. It informed me that my vehicle had been removed for unauthorized parking in a guest overflow zone. Guest overflow zone? I stared at the words until I laughed because the gravel pad had belonged to this property since Ronald Reagan was president. The towing company was 30 miles away. The driver acted like he had repeated the same speech 1,000 times. And by the time I got my truck back, my wallet was $360 lighter. The man behind the counter shrugged and said, "Take it up with the HOA, buddy. We just tell what we're told." I drove back exhausted, parked in the same spot because I believed common sense would eventually win, and spent the night wondering who could possibly think that gravel pad belonged to anyone else. The next morning, I called the HOA office, but the receptionist told me the board president was unavailable and would respond within 5 business days. 5 business days sounded ridiculous for something so obvious. Yet I decided to stay calm because my grandfather always said anger makes smart people negotiate with their emotions instead of their brains. I wish I had known then that the second tow truck was already on its way into my story, because the first one had only been the opening act. I drove home after that second towing bill with my hands locked so tightly around the steering wheel that my knuckles turned white. Not because I couldn't afford another $360, but because I couldn't understand how common sense had disappeared from a place where I had spent half my childhood. My grandfather used to tell me that you could disagree with almost anyone if both sides respected facts. But once people started believing authority was the same thing as truth, the conversation was already over. That sentence kept replaying in my head while I stared at the cabin through the windshield. The gravel parking pad looked exactly the way it had looked 20 years earlier. The same uneven stones, the same worn tire tracks, the same oak tree leaning over one corner. Nothing had changed except the people making decisions about it. Monday morning, I called the HOA office again, and this time the receptionist transferred me directly to the board president, Denise Harper. She answered with a cheerful corporate voice that somehow managed to sound friendly and dismissive at the same time. "Mr. Caldwell, I understand you have concerns regarding your parking violation." I replied, "It's not a concern. My truck was towed twice from my own property." There was a brief silence before she said, "Our compliance committee determined that area falls within the updated community circulation plan." I actually looked out the window to make sure I wasn't losing my mind. Updated community circulation plan? That gravel pad has been beside my cabin since before I was born. She responded, "Historical usage does not necessarily determine present regulatory status." I laughed, not because anything was funny, but because sometimes your brain refuses to accept what your ears just heard. "So let me get this straight," I said. "You changed a map, then charged me for parking where my grandfather parked for 30 years. She replied without hesitation, "You're free to appeal through the proper administrative process." "How much?" I asked. $750. I waited for the punchline. None came. "You're charging me $750 to ask why you towed my truck." "It is a hearing fee," she corrected. "Failure to comply may result in additional enforcement measures." Then she thanked me for my cooperation and ended the call. I sat there staring at my phone, wondering if anyone had ever told her that cooperation usually requires two willing participants. The week somehow became worse. My sister Megan called to tell me that my nephew Tyler was still upset because the first towing incident forced him to miss his flight home after visiting the cabin. Rebooking the ticket had cost hundreds of dollars, and he had missed the first day of orientation for his summer internship. I apologized, even though none of it was my fault. Later that afternoon, I logged into my vacation rental account and found a new review. 1 star. The guest wrote that parking problems created unnecessary stress and that future visitors should stay elsewhere. Within 48 hours, 2 more reservations disappeared from my calendar. I wasn't looking at a bad review anymore. I was watching thousands of dollars quietly evaporate because someone sitting in an HOA meeting decided my driveway belonged to a different category on a spreadsheet. That evening, I walked down to the marina, hoping a little fresh air would calm me down. Instead, I found half a dozen neighbors talking in low voices. Frank Donovan, who had lived around the lake for almost 40 years, nodded when he saw me. "Heard they got you too," he said. I asked what he meant. He pulled a folded letter from his pocket and handed it over. Violation notice. His old storage shed supposedly failed new architectural guidelines, even though the shed had been standing since the late 1980s. His wife, Linda, shook her head and said, "They told us we should be grateful they're improving property values." Another neighbor, Carla Ruiz, rolled her eyes and added, "They sent me a warning because my flower boxes don't match the approved color palette." We all stood there for a second before Frank quietly muttered, "Feels like they aren't running a neighborhood anymore. They're running a kingdom." Nobody laughed because everyone understood exactly what he meant. Walking back to my cabin that night, I realized something important. The problem wasn't my truck. The truck was simply the easiest target. The real issue was power. Once people believe nobody will challenge them, they stop asking whether they're right. They only ask whether they can get away with it. I barely slept, and around midnight, wandered into the attic looking for an old insurance policy my grandfather once mentioned. The attic smelled like cedar and dust, and every box felt like opening another chapter of family history. There were fishing rods older than I was, faded Christmas ornaments, handwritten recipes from my grandmother, and stacks of photographs showing my grandfather standing proudly beside the cabin while holding fish that somehow grew larger every time he retold the story. In one corner sat a dented metal lockbox with his initials painted in white. Inside were property tax receipts, survey maps, utility records, and a thick envelope labeled "Important Never Throw Away." I smiled because that sounded exactly like him. I carried everything downstairs and spread the papers across the dining table. Hours passed while I compared maps, signatures, and county stamps. Most of it looked routine until I unfolded a document attached to the original deed package. The language was dense and formal, the kind that makes your eyes glaze over after 3 paragraphs, but one section forced me to stop reading and start reading again. It stated that the property, together with its established access and designated improvements, would remain exempt from future neighborhood covenants and restrictions created after the date of recording unless the owner voluntarily accepted them in writing. I whispered, "No way," even though nobody else was in the room. I checked the date, years before the HOA even existed. I checked the signatures. Notarized. County recorded. My heartbeat actually sped up. For the first time since the towing incident, I felt something replacing frustration. Hope. Maybe small hope. Maybe misplaced hope, but hope nonetheless. At 1:30 in the morning, I scanned every page and emailed them to a local real estate attorney named Daniel Brooks with a subject line, "Please tell me I'm not crazy." I expected to wait several days for a response. Instead, my phone rang shortly after 7 the next morning. Daniel introduced himself, and the first thing he asked was, "Mr. Caldwell, where exactly did you get these documents?" I told him they had been sitting in my grandfather's attic for decades. He laughed softly and said, "Your grandfather may have just become my favorite client, even if I never had the chance to meet him." Then his voice became serious. "Don't speak with the HOA again until we verify everything through county records. If these filings are authentic, and they certainly appear to be, you may not be the one with the legal problem here." I looked around the cabin at the old wooden walls, the faded photographs, and the gravel pad outside the window where my truck had always belonged. And for the first time since this whole mess started, I had the strange feeling that my grandfather had already prepared an answer to a fight he knew might happen long after he was gone. Daniel called me again that afternoon after spending several hours pulling county records, and I could tell from the silence before he spoke that something had changed. Attorneys usually charge by the hour because they choose their words carefully, but this time he simply said, "Ethan, stop thinking about this as a parking dispute. It isn't. This is a property rights case, and those are two very different things." He explained that the document my grandfather had saved wasn't just an old piece of paper collecting dust in an attic. It had been properly recorded decades earlier, and unless someone could prove it had been legally extinguished, it remained part of the property's history. I leaned back in my chair and looked through the kitchen window toward the gravel pad where my truck sat, wondering how a patch of stone could suddenly become the center of a legal battle. Daniel told me to gather every receipt connected to the towing incidents, every canceled reservation, every email from guests, every photograph I had of the cabin over the years, and every communication from the HOA. "We're not building an argument," he said. "We're building a timeline." The next 2 days turned into a strange mix of detective work and family archaeology. My sister Megan drove over with old photo albums that had been stored in my mother's basement. We spent hours flipping through faded pictures of birthdays, fishing trips, 4th of July cookouts, and Christmas mornings at the cabin. In dozens of those photos, almost hidden in the background, sat my grandfather's pickup truck parked in exactly the same place where mine had been towed from. Megan laughed when she noticed it. Grandpa really never parked anywhere else. Then she looked at me and quietly added, "He also never let anyone push him around." That sentence stayed with me. The following morning, Daniel mailed a formal demand package to the HOA. It wasn't emotional or insulting. It simply laid out the facts, included copies of the recorded documents, listed the financial losses caused by the towing actions and canceled bookings, and requested that the violations be withdrawn before further legal action became necessary. I honestly thought that would end the matter. Even the most stubborn board would surely realize they had made a mistake once an attorney presented actual evidence. Instead, 48 hours later, another certified letter arrived. Denise had signed it herself. According to the letter, the HOA rejected every claim, maintained that its enforcement actions were proper, and reserved the right to pursue additional penalties if I failed to comply with community regulations. At the bottom was a sentence that almost sounded personal. No individual property owner is exempt from maintaining the standards expected by this association. I read it twice before driving to Daniel's office. He skimmed the letter, smiled in a way that made me slightly nervous, and placed it on top of the growing stack of documents. "You know what this means?" he asked. I shook my head. "It means they had a chance to correct the problem after being shown the evidence, and they chose not to. Judges pay attention to that." Word about the dispute slowly spread around the lake. One evening, Frank Donovan knocked on my cabin door, carrying a folder almost 3 inches thick. He set it on my kitchen table and said, "These are every violation notice my wife and I have received over the last 3 years." Soon Carla stopped by with photographs showing changes she had been ordered to make at her own expense. Then another couple arrived with copies of warning letters regarding landscaping that had existed since the early 1990s. Nobody was asking me to fight their battles, but they wanted someone to finally question the assumption that the HOA could never be wrong. For the first time since all this started, I realized I wasn't standing alone. Daniel eventually looked around his office at the growing mountain of paperwork and joked, "Congratulations, Ethan. You accidentally became the guy everyone has been waiting for." I laughed, but inside I felt something heavier than satisfaction. I wasn't trying to lead a rebellion. I just wanted my grandfather's cabin left alone. The hearing date finally arrived on a gray morning with light rain falling across the courthouse parking lot. Denise walked in surrounded by board members who looked confident enough to believe the outcome had already been decided. She nodded politely when she saw me, the kind of nod that says we both know how this ends. Daniel simply carried 2 large binders and whispered, "Let the documents do the talking." The judge listened patiently while both sides presented their arguments. Denise's attorney spoke about maintaining consistency, protecting property values, and enforcing modern standards across the community. Then Daniel stood, walked through the history of the property step by step, introduced the original filings, displayed the survey maps, produced decades of photographs, and finally handed the judge the recorded exemption documents that had survived all those years in my grandfather's attic. The courtroom became strangely quiet. The judge read several pages, asked a few questions about the recording dates, then turned toward the HOA's attorney. "Can you identify where this exemption was lawfully terminated?" he asked. Papers shuffled. Another binder opened. A whispered conversation followed between Denise and her attorney. Finally, the answer came. They could not. At that moment, I realized the case had stopped being about a truck, a gravel pad, or 2 towing bills. It was about whether history written into law could simply be ignored because someone preferred a newer set of rules. As we walked out of the courthouse later that day, Daniel looked at the cabin keys in my hand and smiled. "Your grandfather left you a place to stay," he said. "But today he also left you a lesson. Never underestimate a man who saves paperwork." I drove back toward Silver Pine Lake with the windows down, listening to the tires crunch across the gravel exactly where they belonged, and I couldn't help but wonder how many other people had quietly paid fines simply because nobody had ever told them that sometimes the strongest voice in the room isn't the loudest one, it's the one backed by the truth. And that's where the real fight was only beginning.